Corbyn promised Labour would abolish them altogether.
After the election, some in number 10 were talking about abolishing fees too. A dramatic cut is now being played down, but Tory MPs are urging the Chancellor, here at number 11, to do something for students in this autumn's budget.
Labour would raise taxes on higher earners to pay for their fees policy and say the government must act.
They have to do something about tuition fees because, quite frankly, it's unsustainable. Most of the fees at the moment will currently not be paid anyway, but actually a lot of our young people are having to carry that burden around their necks. Well, I don't think that's right.
More students than ever are going to university, but with fees, living costs and interest rates rising, the pressure for change is unlikely to let up. Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Well, here at Worcester University, there's around 10,000 students on the various courses here. We've been talking to a cross-section of them during the course of the day, and every single one that we've spoken to, perhaps not surprisingly, given that they haven't made the decision to come here, thinks that university is worthwhile, that the financial debt that they're going to be left with, some £50,000 at the end of their course, is worthwhile, not just because of the academic qualification, but because of the other things that they get from being here. The access to the courses, the chance to live independently with a bit of a safety net around you, and also the chance to actually be in the world of work. But because of tuition fees, nearly every single student we've spoken to today also has a part-time job. So they say they are already entering into the world of work. We asked you at home as well for your thoughts about it. We had quite a lot of response on Twitter. Martin Bannister says he thinks too much emphasis is placed on academic achievement in jobs today. There should be more recognition for skills and experience. Klaas Martensen says personally he thinks university should be free, funded through reasonable taxes. You can never have too much knowledge. Well, tuition fees are being examined by the government. It may feature in the autumn statement coming up, and with around a third of all 18 to 24-year-olds in further education now. This is a big issue, not just for students, but for the country as a whole. We're going to have more on this in Ian King Live, but for the time being, let's cross over to Sky Sports with the latest from them.
See you at the top.
This sports bulletin is brought to you by Vitality, for life insurance that rewards healthy living.
Hi there, Diego Costa is on his way back to Atletico Madrid after the Spanish side agreed terms with Chelsea. Costa hasn't featured at all for Chelsea this season, having been told by head coach Antonio Conte in the summer that he would no longer be required. The player will now have a medical in Madrid and discuss personal terms. He won't be able to make his debut until January when the transfer window reopens. The Tottenham manager Mauricio Pochettino has dismissed suggestions that they'll need to win trophies to keep Harry Kane at the club. Kane has scored 4 goals so far for Spurs this season.
More for Harry Kane, what he wants to do. And only the answer is Harry Kane have the power or the decision or the possibility to say what he wants to.
For life insurance that rewards healthy living. Vitality.
Now, if you're a bodybuilder, this is your dream. An impromptu visit from this guy here, Big Arnie. Leeds gym owner Ricky Moore opened his doors for the 7-time Mr. Olympian. Before he left, well, he thanked Ricky before adding, of course, those famous words, "I'll be back." Ian King is live. Stay with us.
From the Sky News City studio, I'm Ian King with a special programme on student debt and universities. Sky News reveals that the dropout rate for some courses is as high as 67%. A Sky data poll finds almost two-thirds of people believe tuition fees should be reduced or scrapped altogether. We'll be asking, is university worth it?
I've chosen to go, so I really hope that it's worth it at the end of this.
Sort of pay will take me longer, and then the difference is I'll have a bit more to start off with because I'm not paying off debt.
We'll look at how universities boost economic growth. And it's a £17.5 billion black hole in the university's pension fund, the real reason why fees have risen so fast. Well, let's start this special programme with some numbers. £9,250, that's the annual cost of university tuition in England. And 67, that's the percentage of students who drop out of some courses. What exactly do they get for their money? And what benefit does it bring to us as a society? Well, in the next half hour, we'll hear from students, educators and policymakers. First is our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen.
Universities and their finances are soaring up the political agenda. The anger that prompted demonstrations and nearly wiped out the Liberal Democrats still lingers on. And the question hanging over students and politicians is a degree worth cost.
Unification of universities, where students go there, they pay the £9,000 tuition fees, get coming out with a huge load, yet not getting recognised skills that could lead to its isolation and downfall.
Sky News research has found dropout rates are as high as 67% on some courses.
Trapped beneath crumpled buildings in central Mexico.
A BSc course in entrepreneurship had a 50% withdrawal rate, 67% dropped out of a degree in marketing and consumer psychology. At the University of East London, the dropout rate for computer game development was 58%. 67% dropped out of a human resources management course at Middlesex University. And at Sunderland University, 33% dropped out of a degree in information technology.
Each individual student who leaves their course early, this is a personal tragedy. They've invested a huge amount of time, emotional energy and ambition into their courses. But it's very telling that universities where individual courses have dropout rates of 40, 50, 60% are the same universities that have overall dropout rates of more than 10%. So it's clear that there's something systematically going wrong.
In a statement, the university's Minister Joe Johnson told Sky, "I urge these universities to take action and look urgently at these courses to ensure that students and the taxpayer are receiving value for money for their investment in higher education. Dropout rates are now lower than they were in 2009, but we know there is more work to do." Fees at £9,000 a year and rising have been under the spotlight since Jeremy Corbyn promised Labour would abolish them altogether.
After the election, some in number 10 were talking about abolishing fees too. A dramatic cut is now being played down, but Tory MPs are urging the Chancellor, here at number 11, to do something for students in this autumn's budget.
Labour would raise taxes on higher earners to pay for their fees policy and say the government must act.
They have to do something about tuition fees because, quite frankly, it's unsustainable. Most of the fees at the moment will currently not be paid anyway, but actually a lot of our young people are having to carry that burden around their necks. Well, I don't think that's right.
More students than ever are going to university, but with fees, living costs and interest rates rising, the pressure for change is unlikely to let up. Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Well, have a look at this. Official figures from the student loan company show debt from tuition fees and loans now stands at more than £100 billion, and it's rising all the time. We commissioned a Sky data poll to show what people think of the cost of a university education. First, we asked whether university tuition fees should be higher, lower or scrapped altogether. Only 3% said they should be higher. Almost two-thirds said they should be lower or scrapped altogether. We also asked whether debts for recent graduates should be written off. 38% said yes, 47% said no. And we asked, in terms of time and money, is university worth the costs? Well, 54% said yes and only 35% said no. Well, shortly we will be discussing this with Dr. Diana Beach. She's Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Higher Education Policy Institute, and Anastasia Deval. She's Deputy Director of the think tank Civitas. But first, let's hear from two young people who made different decisions.
So I decided to go to university because I thought if I get a degree in a professional subject, it would set me up with a better chance of getting a job later. I did look at some apprenticeships, and although the whole sort of being paid to work thing is appealing, I don't know whether it would have benefited me in the way that it benefits people who are more practical thinkers.
Listen to the radio about how many people are going and getting degrees and not pursuing the job with the degree they wanted to do. It made me actually realise, well, what I want to do, I could probably be better off doing an apprenticeship and getting some experience with what I want to do as a career. Do you think university is worth it?
I think it's a really difficult question. Obviously, I've chosen to go, so I really hope that it's worth it at the end of this. It's 3 years of my life.
When I finish this qualification, for me to get the sort of pay you'll be getting with the degree sort of pay will take me longer. And then the difference is I'll have a bit more to start off with because I'm not paying off debt. It can be a constant problem, debt. Especially after, it's the last thing you want when you finish university.
There's thousands, millions of people that go to university, so everyone's going to have the same debt, although it's going to weigh down quite heavily. So you're not alone in having the debt, and obviously you don't have to pay it back unless you earn a certain amount.
I think you having to pay for it makes you want to do it more.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, because you think, well, I paid for this, so I need to crack now.
Yeah,
which is why I think uni pass rates are going up, hopefully, I think that's the last time I heard. So I think it's a bit of a motivation to do it. Not saying that I'm not motivated.
We've got 3 years left to go, and then we'll see how it works out, and I hope it's worth it. But yeah, I mean, from what I've seen so far, it seems like a lovely place, and I'm definitely glad I chose to come. So.
Is it worth it? Is university worth it? It is for some people, but not for me.
Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Diana Beach. She's Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Higher Education Policy Institute, and by Anastasia Deval. She's Deputy Director of the think tank Civitas. Anastasia, I'll start with you. Is it the fact that there are a lot of people going to university for questionable degrees and amassing debts on the back of it?
I think there are some people doing that. I think a lot of it is about not being informed about options. I think that there is an emphasis that only university is the route to success, and I think that's what we need to talk about. And I'm so pleased that you're doing this on Sky today, talking about higher education, listening to young people's views about it. We need to discuss the realities, which is not to say going to university is a bad thing at all, but we need to look at the options, and we need to look at the courses, see which ones are valuable, and see which ones are really going to set young people up for the futures that they want.
So we should really be asking hard questions about the economic value that they bring, some of these courses.
Absolutely, and just simply the value. Is it going to be something that you find stimulating? I think the main problem, as I say, is that there's a sense that you have to go to university if you're going to be successful. We know that there are lots of very successful, high-profile, famous people, very successful in their careers, didn't go to university, but did, for example, in-work training routes. Now, it's not about saying one is better than the other, but it's about saying there are other options, and do scrutinise the course that you're about to fork out a lot of money for.
All right, well, Diana, let's bring you in at this point. What do you think of what Anastasia's just been saying? I mean, basically, we should be a bit more questioning, a bit more judicious about sending half the population to university.
Good evening. I would actually disagree with that. I think the value of a university education is there for all to see. There are financial benefits, so graduate earning potential. I know men can earn, on average in a lifetime, £170,000 more, and women that stretches to £250,000 more. But there's more benefits than that. There's the cultural and social ones that are often not spoken about as well, and you're not necessarily going to get these if you go out to work. And these are things like going away from home, getting transferable skills, living with others. It's much more about the subject that you study.
Right, but I mean, should the taxpayer necessarily be paying for people to learn things like going out and getting drunk and socialising?
I don't think going to university is about getting drunk and socialising. Actually, one of the benefits shows that in later life, graduates are actually more inclined not to drink, not to be obese, and to eat healthily. So graduates actually have 8% higher life expectancy.
Anastasia, what do you think of that?
I I think it's about having useful experiences, obviously, as becoming an adult, becoming employable. And actually, I think it's interesting that we're hearing a lot of employers saying that graduates aren't necessarily coming out with the skills that they want. But I think the other thing to say is not going to university doesn't mean stopping your education. Apprenticeships, I mean, they are full programs. Good apprenticeships are very high quality. You might go and live elsewhere. You will have colleagues. You will have an experience that you know, what we're hearing about in relation to the university experience. So I think that's the thing I'd really encourage. Let's stop thinking about university as the only way to be educated later on. There are actually in-work training schemes, but also an apprenticeship is a continuation of education. It's not about just going straight into a job and starting the job, and we've got to factor that in to the reality, and we've also got to give that, I think, the necessary showing that it requires for young people.
Diana Beach, that's a real issue, isn't it? I mean, we are now in a situation where, because we're sending half the country to university, a lot of jobs which previously didn't require degree-level qualifications now do.
Yes, that is true, but I think, as I said before, it's more than the subject that's studied. It's about the transferable skills, and that comes with the university experience. And I think, as Anastasia was saying, there are degree apprenticeships now, so that's sort of a halfway house between earning and learning, and actually having the full benefits that university experience provides you with. And as I said, those are the cultural and the social benefits of living with others, living away from home, and flourishing as a person.
Diana, you mentioned just now the huge gap in earnings. I think you said £250,000 that a female graduate can expect to earn over their working life compared with a non-graduate. In your view, does that justify tuition fees?
I think it does, yes. I think the personal financial rewards does justify graduates making back a contribution to what they've borrowed, but only if they can afford to do so. And at the moment, that is, the current threshold is if they earn over £21,000.
We've got this big row at the moment over the pay of university vice-chancellors. Do you think some of them should be volunteering for pay cuts to restore confidence in the higher education sector?
I think personally, in my personal point of view, subject to Vice-Chancellor pay levels is a matter for individual universities, and the magic of our higher education system is its diversity and the fact that we do have different types of institutions. Some are local, some are global, some bring in big revenue, and some specialise in, you know, not so profitable subjects like the creative arts. So I think what the public need to see is that their leaders are getting a salary that is proportionate to the type of institution that they are, and also the changes that are being made to this institution. And I think above all, what the public needs to see is that there are fair pay differentials between the different grades and jobs within a university.
All right, last word to you, Anastasia, very briefly. Should we be turning some modern universities back into polytechnics?
I think we need to have a broader landscape when it comes to higher education so that universities can really do what they're best at, so that we have a breadth of skills and so that students really have options. I think at the moment it's about not having enough options and not being well informed enough. All right, Anastasia de Waal here in rainy London and Diana Beach in sunny Manchester. Thanks both for joining me. Now, of course, university education doesn't just pay off for the individual with a good degree, at least in theory, leading to higher wages. There is evidence that higher education drives growth across the whole economy. Well, Anna Valero is the research officer for the Centre of Economic Performance at the London School of Economics.
Well, universities affect growth through a number of channels. Perhaps most obviously is the channel of producing graduates who are skilled people or human capital. And human capital is very important for growth. That's been established in the economics literature. The other key channel is through innovation. Universities, through the graduates that they produce, who then go on to be scientists and produce innovations, universities are a location for research as well, housing labs where scientists work on research, often in collaboration with local businesses. So these are the two kind of key venues through which we might think that universities affect growth, but there's actually some other avenues as well.
And can you put a figure on the total contribution to UK GDP of Britain's universities? Is it possible to do that?
Well, Universities UK have estimated that it might be just under 3% GDP, but they carry out quite a direct accounting exercise, kind of looking at the expenditure of universities, local multiplier effects, A wider analysis would include also the effects through kind of the skilled people going out into the workforce, the associated spillovers from skilled people in local areas. There's a large economic literature based on the US that's proved that there are these spillover effects. It's related to agglomeration economies, and similarly with the innovation. So that's definitely a lower bound.
And how do Britain's universities compare with other countries in terms of the value that they add?
Well, British universities are, they're world leading in most of the international league tables. So, for example, the Times Higher Education rankings, there are about 5 UK universities in the top 20 worldwide arts and humanities universities. I think 5 in the top 21 social sciences, and obviously some top universities in all different disciplines.
There's obviously a big debate going on about the UK's lousy productivity record. Are universities contributing to that by churning out lots of graduates with fairly worthless degrees?
Well, I mean, the UK's productivity record, it's got a lot worse since the financial crisis, and I wouldn't say that universities have kind of changed since then. So we have a long-running gap with our main comparators. It's now about 30 percentage points with Germany, France and America. But the gap has got wider since the financial crisis, so it's unlikely, that the universities are contributing to that. I would argue the opposite, that universities have actually accounted for a lot of the productivity growth we've seen, particularly kind of since the 1960s. That's the period we've seen a widespread kind of increase in both the number of universities and the enrolments at universities. There's a lot of evidence, that graduates are continuing to earn more, which means they're valued more in the labour market and therefore more productive. And skills are fundamental really to productivity, the ability to generate innovations, like I said, management practices, managerial skills, workforce skills are very important for management practices, which are another driver of productivity.
Sure, but as you say, our productivity record has slipped behind the likes of Germany. Germany sends far fewer of its young people to university and far more than we do on apprenticeships and technical courses.
Yeah, so I think there is a kind of a well-known gap here in terms of our technical skills. So there's more that further education colleges can do. And also when we're thinking about the value of degrees, there is quite a lot of difference between different courses and different institutions. So there's some recent analysis from the IFS that looks at big data to try and track the outcomes of people from different courses in different universities. So, there are probably some cases where for certain individuals a very well-designed technical education or vocational education course could better serve them.
Well, the pound had a good session against the US dollar ahead of Theresa May's speech tomorrow in Florence after falling against the greenback on Wednesday evening after the US Federal Reserve indicated there would be at least one more interest rate rise this year. Sterling rallied sharply on expectations the Prime Minister will seek a 2-year transition period after Brexit. Meanwhile, against the euro, pound is more or less unchanged. On a good day for European stock markets, the FTSE 100 actually fell, dragged lower by consumer stocks. One of the biggest FTSE fallers has a link with our theme this evening of universities. Compass Group, the world's biggest contract caterer. It's a major provider of meals in colleges and universities. But today, it fell by 2.5% on news that Richard Cousins, its well-regarded chief executive, is standing down. Still to come here on Ian King Live, we will look at the pensions black hole that's putting pressure on university finances.
Chinese and Australian soldiers have ended a series of military exercises in the mountainous terrain of southwestern China. A Defence Ministry statement said the small training manoeuvres were the first joint drills the two countries have held in China. 10 soldiers from each country's army participated in the exercise, which lasted 10 days. Hong Kong's last British governor, Chris Patten, has urged China to understand Hong Kong. He said the Hong Kong people have a strong sense of their own identity during a speech at an event to launch his new book in Hong Kong.
Because one of the things which I think is very special about Hong Kong is that it's a Chinese city, but it's a Chinese city with a great sense of what it means to be here in Hong Kong. There's a real sense of Hong Kong citizenship when you ask people about their identity. That doesn't make them less Chinese.
Greenpeace activists have boarded a cargo ship off the UK coast to protest Volkswagen's diesel cars. The activists boarded the ship in an attempt to keep it from docking and unloading a cargo of Volkswagen cars due for delivery at the port of Sheerness in Kent, East England. An aeroplane carrying the first batch of Chinese disaster relief supplies is leaving for hurricane-hit Cuba. Hurricane Irma thrashed central and west Cuba and has forced 1.7 million people to evacuate so far. To support the government and people of Cuba, the Chinese government are providing multiple rounds of emergency humanitarian assistance and offering $1 million in cash.
Welcome back. You're watching Ian King Live. As we've been discussing throughout this programme, this generation of students in England expect to leave university with £50,000 worth of debt. One reason that fees have risen so sharply is the black hole of up to £17.5 billion in the university's pension fund, the university's superannuation scheme. Well, I'm joined now by the independent pension consultant, John Ralph. John, you know more about this scheme than most people. Why is it in such a pickle?
Hello, Ian. It's in a pickle. It's the largest scheme in the country. It's got the largest deficit. It's completely out of control. It hasn't been properly managed. Universities seem to be in denial about the problem. Certainly USS seems to be in denial about the problem, and I'm not sure whether they're grabbing it by the scruff of the neck and sorting it out properly.
So what's the problem? I mean, obviously we hear a lot about pension deficits being exaggerated by the fact that the discount rate, interest rates are very, very low. Is it down to that, or is it down to bad investment decisions?
It's down to a number of things. Lots of companies are closing their pension schemes. It's just too expensive to have the traditional final salary pension where you get a certain amount of pension depending how long you've worked for the company. People are living too long, and the amount that you can get on the money that invested has just gone down. And there's absolutely no reason to think that USS should be immune from that. USS has exaggerated the problem. Its problem is very much of its own making because it's taken a bet over the last 40 years since it was set up. It's taken a bet on equities. For the first 20, 25 years, that paid off. For the last few years, it hasn't. And my concern is that USS is in denial about that.
So what's the pension regulator done about this? Should they have stopped the rot?
Well, we don't know. I mean, the pension regulator is very important. The pension regulators had a kicking over the last few months from the Working Pension Select Committee on BHS, for example. I think the pension regulator will be looking at this very carefully. We don't know what the pension regulator thinks. The pension regulator isn't going to tell us, and universities aren't going to tell us, but they certainly will be taking a very, very careful note of this because of the size of the underlying deficit and the potential problems that might create.
So what are the universities going to have to do to close the gap? I mean, this is the key reason, presumably, why tuition fees are having to rise, is it?
Well, we don't know. Universities would say there isn't that causal link, But if more money has to go into the pension scheme, you mentioned a £17.5 billion deficit, we're talking about university contributions having to double just to plug that deficit. That's got to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? Well, it's got to come from student fees. Student fees don't necessarily go up from 9,000 to 10,000, but the quality of education probably goes down.
Is there a bit of a generational unfairness issue here in that young lecturers, people coming into the university system now to teach, are now going to have to make more of a contribution to their pensions, or in some cases even to pay for more generous pensions for older lecturers?
I think that's right. I think we're going to find that the younger lecturers will end up, when they retire, with a smaller pension than the people who are on the verge of retirement now. Nevertheless, I think that what USS has got to do, what Universities UK has got to do, which represents all the universities, is bite the bullet. They've got to close the defined benefit final salary scheme altogether. They've got to move to defined contribution, set at a fairly generous level, and then they've got to use the money that they save to plug the deficit. And I'm not sure whether there are many more chances for them to do that. They fudged it 3 years ago. I think if they fudge it now, rather than taking drastic action, it's only going to get worse.
So very briefly, John, if they don't do something fairly shortly, then this is going to tip universities into a bigger financial crisis.
I think all we'll be doing is kicking the can down the road.
All right, John Ralph, we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thanks for joining me. Good to see you. And that's it from me. You've been watching Ian King Live. A reminder, there's video content and analysis on the business page of the Sky News website, plus our interviews on the Sky News YouTube channel. Next up, it's Sky News Tonight with Dermot Murnaghan. Thanks for joining me. Good night.
It's 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Tonight. The top story: Theresa May prepares for her biggest Brexit speech. A show of unity from the Cabinet as the Prime Minister travels to Italy with an offer to the EU to accept a transitional deal. But the EU's chief negotiator warns that the UK is not offering enough, with just a year left to agree on the terms of Brexit. Well, coming up, we'll be live in Florence on the eve of Theresa May's big Brexit speech. Also tonight. Desperate search for survivors of the Mexico earthquake, and it's believed the death toll could rise beyond 250. Rescuers are focusing on a school in the capital and frantic efforts to save a schoolgirl still trapped under the rubble. Also tonight, pilots hit back at the Ryanair boss Michael O'Leary, who's warned them not to turn down offers to help solve the cancellation crisis.
Once you are trained and skilled at doing it, it is not nobody, and I would challenge any pilot to explain how this is either a difficult job or how it is they are overworked.
A friend of the London Bridge attack ringleader is jailed for spreading terrorist propaganda and filming outside Windsor Castle. And calls for government action after Sky News research reveals dropout rates as high as 2/3 on some university courses. A very good evening. Theresa May has been attempting to establish an agreed approach to Brexit amongst her cabinet colleagues before she delivers a much-anticipated speech on the subject in Italy tomorrow. Now, the men who most represent the different positions on Brexit within the cabinet, Boris Johnson and the Chancellor Philip Hammond, were all smiles as they emerged from the 2.5-hour meeting together. Now, the issue of how much money the UK will pay to leave, of course, has become the biggest sticking point in the negotiations. And EU leaders are expecting Mrs May to say that the UK will honour its financial obligations. Our senior political correspondent, Jason Farrell, reports.
Back from New York, and time to face down her warring cabinet and set out her own vision for Brexit. The Chancellor wants a soft, standstill transition period. The Foreign Secretary has made demands to shorten it and to stop payments to the EU budget. The Home Secretary has accused him of backseat driving, but his Vote Leave ally and once political assassin Michael Gove is supportive. Are you keeping up? 2.5 hours later, they emerged, apparently united.
Very united, very good, all behind the speech.
2.5 hours, we'll say.
Yeah, very
disagreements at the table?
No, very constructive.
And Theresa May has got the backing of her Foreign Secretary?
She has the backing of the Cabinet, all of us.
Was there a coming together? The two factions of Leave and Remain, Johnson and Hammond, were side by side, the Chancellor walking further than he needed to with the Foreign Secretary before turning back to number 11. And one backbencher was happy to joke about the rift that seemed to have settled for now.
I'm not going to say anything, thank you very much, except that I haven't been appointed Foreign Secretary.
Sources within the government tell me that each cabinet member was given a copy of the speech to read. They then discussed it and apparently all agreed upon it. Now, one thing that was agreed is that the UK doesn't want an off-the-shelf Swiss-style or Canadian-style deal. Theresa May is pushing for a bespoke arrangement. But Chief EU negotiator Michel Barnier today issued a warning that Britain can't cherry-pick what it wants from a future deal, and it must settle its accounts before any talk of trade or transition, saying it was a question of trust. Barnier is preempting expectation that the Prime Minister will talk about the so-called divorce bill. Eurosceptics just want the divorce speeded up.
If they're going to carry on like this, why don't we just come out tomorrow? Let's stop wasting. We'd save 10 billion quid. We could get on with it. Business would know where we are. We'd be on world trade rules. You know, if people are just being that impossible, you can't deal with them. So maybe that's what the Prime Minister's going to say tomorrow. That would be a good thing. Say, I've had enough of them. I'm coming out tomorrow. I'll be very happy if she said that.
But perhaps part of Theresa May's speech is an attempt to go over the Commission negotiators' head and appeal to the big players such as Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, who she met in New York, and the likes of Netherlands leader Mark Rutte, to apply pressure on the Commission to remove conditions that are stalling the talks. If the rift in Cabinet has been settled, that's only part of the battle. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Well, our political editor, Faisal Islam, is in Florence, where Theresa May will deliver that Brexit speech tomorrow. And as has been often said, Faisal, a city with a very long history of political machinations.
Indeed, and no coincidence that Michel Barnier getting his preemptive speech in 200 miles away in Rome today chose to quote Machiavelli in a positive way, saying essentially that there's always a way to find a way through any problems as long as there is the willingness. And that is the point with this speech that we're going to get tomorrow afternoon here in this historic city. It isn't just about the audience between David Davis and Michel Barnier, that single negotiations. There's another 4 or 5 negotiations that Theresa May has to settle within her own cabinet, with MPs, with the people of Britain, with business interests who are concerned about just how quickly we are now going to get the issue of the changes in their arrangements for whether it's the financial services or the car industry, but also that idea of bypassing Michel Barnier, going straight to some of the EU leaders. So she's coming all the way out here with Boris Johnson, with Philip Hammond, who put on that show of unity, and also with David Davis. And I think that she will have scored a victory in terms of cabinet unity by getting Boris Johnson. We heard all of that, those complaints from him in that article, but it turns out pretty much he's signed up to the idea of settling the account up until 2020, a key ask from Michel Barnier. Will that be enough to unlock trade talks? This is the question. More, I think, is required. That was the message from Michel Barnier. Will it be too